Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third in IFSA's leadership series of webinars. I'm Heather Barclay-Hamir, President and CEO of IFSA, the Institute for Study Abroad. And I am looking forward to another thoughtful exploration of a topic that is important to our field with all of you. Today, our topic is the future of non-traditional locations. And I have to tell you at IFSA, this is near and dear to our hearts because by the definition that you're going to hear in a moment, 50% of our locations count as non-traditional. All of us have seen program suspensions, sites shuttered permanently, and so there is a real concern about what that future is and what happens when things start to settle down and we are rebuilding study abroad enrollment. So our conversation today is going to be structured around 4 core questions that our panelists will respond to in turn. But as a reminder, these webinars are really intended as a discussion. So please feel free to jump in if you want to share something, chat whatever you're thinking about so you don't lose the thought. I know how it is when you hear a lot of interesting discussion. And join us in the conversation to share and to explore together. Before we begin, you can go forward one, Margaret. I just want to point out our next topic for May, which is navigating financial challenges in the face of uncertainty. Can't imagine where we came up with that topic from. I hope you'll join us. We're going to chat you the registration link if that topic is of interest to you. And if you have ideas of conversations you would like to have, discussions that we should be exploring together, please chat those or reach out to anyone at IFSA so we can have a further conversation. All of the discussions that are part of this series have been sourced through conversations with you, with our campus colleagues. So I would like to turn it over now to our 2 presenters. Nicole Desjardins Gowdy is the Director of Study Abroad at Pomona College, and Heather Thompson, Director of Education Abroad at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you both for joining us today.
Hello, our pleasure.
Thanks so much for having us. So I'm going to start by giving an overview of Pomona College and our education abroad profile. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Pomona, we're a small private liberal arts college about 30 miles outside of Los Angeles. We have around 1,600 undergraduate students and we're purely an undergraduate institution. Our Office of Study Abroad is housed under Academic Affairs. And we have 3 full-time staff, a graduate intern, and student workers who are primarily peer mentors. About half of our students participate in semester or academic year study abroad. So that means we work with around 200 students a year. And we operate 5 of our own programs, and the rest of our programs are in partnership with third-party providers. So we have 58 third-party provider programs within our portfolio. Our primary focus over the past several years has really been on increasing access, equity, inclusion, diversifying students and the programs available, and curriculum integration. So I'll talk a little bit later about that as well. But before the pandemic, we were really focusing on increasing the options available to students in non-traditional destinations. Recently, we did programs in Colombia, Sri Lanka, South Korea, Rwanda, India, Tanzania, and Jordan, and we're really excited about those options. But then the pandemic hit, and we haven't had student mobility since spring of 2020. 4 of our top programs, really excellent programs, have closed in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, which was really sad, especially after all the effort we've been making to really try to increase participation in non-traditional locations. And so there's obviously the question of when is access going to reopen to some of these destinations. In the time being, we launched a new program this spring called Global Partnership Courses, where we offered a slate of courses in partnership with our one of our directors of a Pomona program, as well as our third-party providers, offering courses and virtual internship seminars and languages. And the primary emphasis was actually on non-traditional destinations. And we see this as a really great opportunity to support programs that might have low enrollments or where they may be closed for some time. We're really relying on our partners to still be there throughout and after the pandemic. So we saw it as kind of a contribution we could make to the longevity longevity of those programs, but also an opportunity now, and we've extended it through the 2021-2022 academic year to really give students a chance to connect with non-traditional destinations in small ways, or even as part of a full curriculum. So that's kind of a snapshot of Pomona, and I'll pass it to Heather.
Hi, everybody. I'm Heather Thompson, Director of Education Abroad. Give you a little overview of the University of Texas. We are one of the large flagship universities in the state of Texas with over 51,000 students per year at the undergraduate and graduate level. We do have a decentralized, centralized model, but all of our units that have to do with internationalization fall under something called Texas Global, this large concept of global activities for the university, and is led by a senior vice provost who is, as you can tell, falls under our provost for the academic side of the house. We have 4 primary teams. There's a huge team that I manage that is at the central office, and then we have decentralized offices in business and engineering and law that deal with those populations and then dovetail into the central administration. I've put on here our pre-COVID staffing levels and our post-COVID staffing levels. I am very happy to, not happy, but I do like to clarify for people when I give out these numbers that we were lucky that we did not have to lay anyone off, but regardless, we have still had pretty massive attrition. People going to other career fields in particular, or other parts of the university. Normally we would be a very different profile than Nicole. We were getting close to provider level numbers, 4,500 almost students a year. This year we just finished our open doors numbers like everybody else, I think, last Thursday, and we're going to be sitting right at 1,700 for this last year. We stopped travel, of course, summer 2020, but UT Austin does not follow strict State Department guidelines, and so we were able to reopen travel for fall 20, spring 21. We have students abroad now, and we'll have students abroad this summer and this fall, which I know is also very unusual compared to some of my colleagues that might be on this call. Like Nicole, a very strong mission and vision connected to creating access. We've been focusing on all types of levels of access, even things that go all the way back to when Heather and I were partners in crime, creating access for first generation college students, non-traditional locations, all of those kinds of things. I've listed a few examples of those there for you. And then during the pandemic, I just wanted to say that the students that we have had abroad are not actually where you would necessarily think. Yes, they are actually in some non-traditional locations, some smaller cities in Europe, lots of students in Asia. We have had students in parts of the Middle East and Latin America. So we have been able to at least maintain a little bit of mobility to non-traditional locations during this time, but we have a huge focus on Mexico in particular, and trying to make sure that the Mexico partnerships come back robust and strong after the pandemic. Has been quite a bit of conversation on our campus lately around that in particular. So with that, I'll pass it back over. Actually, I think it's me again. I'll keep going unless anybody wants to chime in. So in preparing for this conversation, Nicole and I and Margaret had some pre-sessions, as you all can imagine, and we were really thinking about what does a non-traditional location mean to everyone. And I just want you to stop for a minute and think about what it means for you. What does non-traditional on your campus mean? Like I said a minute ago, for us, Asia is not non-traditional for UT Austin. It's actually starting to, in some ways, some semesters rival parts of Europe. So, but for many people, Asia is. Whereas Nicole has a super amazing footprint in Africa and the Middle East, and Texas has almost zero footprint in Africa. So Africa for us is very non-traditional location. So stop and think about it. Write yourself some notes down. We also had conversations about this concept of defining non-traditional locations. For today's conversation, we're going to focus mainly on the standard definition of things outside of Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand. But there are other definitions of non-traditional, big city versus small city, right? It pains me to get students to go to the center of France, right? The center of France is very non-traditional, but you know, because everyone wants to go to Paris or Strasbourg or Toulouse or someplace like that, a larger city. So for us, part of our profile is big city versus little city, or what we call mega cities. We have a huge trend for mega cities and getting students to disperse themselves outside of Barcelona, for example, to explore other locations. And then as we were going through this kind of thinking about the framing for today, we also landed on this concept of why are non-traditional locations important? The why to explaining it to students. Students always ask us, you know, in advising, well, why should I go there? Or what's unique about that? And Nicole and I came to this kind of consensus that it is about ensuring, first and foremost, that undergraduate students gain perspective, differing perspectives during college. And that is, first and foremost, one of the goals of helping students go someplace off, if you will, off the beaten path. But off the beaten path doesn't have to be, for example, Africa. It doesn't have to have that connotation anymore, right? And to some degree, old timers like me, because I'm getting up there in my years, I have to be mindful of using certain terminology, because what off the beaten path means to me versus what it means to a student might mean things totally different. So we would love to hear your thoughts on what you think are non-traditional locations, or why you think non-traditional locations are important. So as Heather was saying, we're going to try to make this a dialogue today as best we can. So you can put some things in the chat if you want to follow along, but thinking about those fundamental ways that we can help students gain unique perspectives, and really framing a non-traditional location and non-traditional programming around that element.
Which I believe is there we go, the first question.
There it goes, yep. All right.
So what about for others on the call? I mean, from the provider side, it's a little hard to speak to non-traditional because it's IFSA's tradition to have these places. But I'm curious if on other campuses, you've also had a conversation and defined what non-traditional means and how you are or are not trying to promote it. Interesting. So we have a chat. I always struggle with the idea that a smaller city often equates to a more authentic experience. It's an interesting observation. Do you want to elaborate? See, now nobody's going to chat because I'm going to pick on them.
Well, Nicole, why don't we start off just with our part of the dialogue? Yeah.
So yeah, as Heather pointed out, I think for us, it's really about alternate perspectives. You know, so for a little bit, for me, my background, I studied abroad in undergrad in Sydney, Australia, and then later went on to do the Peace Corps in Cameroon and West Africa and lead gap year programs abroad in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. And so for me, I just see it's a big difference in terms of exposing students to values and cultures and norms and perspectives outside of their regular frames of reference. It helps personally, it helps professionally, just to have the idea of kind of a collectivist versus individualist culture, or just different ways of living your life and approaching problems. And I think it also helps students to deepen their understandings of the variety of livelihoods and societies and different approaches to different topics. And it gives them a curiosity and an understanding of the world outside of Western Europe and Australia, New Zealand, the places that are kind of quote unquote traditionally appreciated so much in the United States and looked to. It just gives them a more nuanced view of the world. Also, I think that the approaches to programming in non-traditional locations can be very different and provide more facilitated opportunities for deeper engagement. So many non-traditional locations will feature a homestay or a core course that really delves into the local context and looks at a particular theme or just kind of society as a whole through a more guided and nuanced way. Students have opportunities for research and experiential learning. And I think students kind of go into it often with a different mindset, right? We all know that you know, stereotypically, the non-traditional locations tend to attract a different type of student than many of the traditional locations, and they approach their experience from a very different mindset. And I would also think that that's something that we can kind of if we look at non-traditional in terms of geographic, but then also non-traditional in terms of internal, where are we encouraging our students to go internally that's not part of the traditional narrative of study abroad? Not just about going and checking off landmarks and visiting different cities and countries, but about kind of what are you seeing? How are you growing? How are you approaching the experience that's kind of outside of the dominant narrative about what study abroad is?
I would add to that one of the lens for us about non-traditional locations has a lot to do with career readiness and looking at career sectors and helping students understand and identify where their career sector is going to be moving in the next 5 years. Is it Malaysia because of tech and we have nothing in Malaysia? If anybody has a program in Malaysia, let me know. But right, and we have a huge factory in Austin that connects with Malaysia. Is it again, like I said, is it for Texas especially, and maybe some of my California and Arizona colleagues, migration patterns from Central and South America and the impact of that on our K-12 teachers, and making sure that our K-12 teachers coming out of the university have perspectives that are going to help them in the classroom. So this very core connection to career applicability. And that's on us as study abroad leaders and program providers and developers of initiatives to make sure that when we look at it from those career lenses, that the opportunities are there and that all of our education programs aren't just focused in Europe, for example. So we look at it a lot through that career lens. And it's not always the easiest sell. And we're not saying any of this is an easy sell to the students or the faculty or our leadership, but if we know that it's what's right for the students, then that's where we need to put our energies, which is what my team focuses on.
Yeah, and if I'd add one more thing, it kind of goes back to what Heather was saying about defining non-traditional locations. I think they're really a moving target. Non-traditional and traditional is based on where people have historically gone, right? And encouraging students to go to non-traditional locations is about helping them to include new voices and new views and new ways of doing in their sphere of awareness, right? And in the depth of understanding. And so it's got to be a moving target. It's got to be a continual assessment of where are students going? How can we encourage them to go to different places? What's not being visited? How can we deepen their engagement wherever they're going? And so I don't think it's a static, Western Europe, everywhere else. But I do think it's something that needs continual examination at the institutional level.
Really great points. And there's some excellent conversation happening in the chat. I hope you all have that open so that you can see that. In the interest of time, we'll keep us moving forward, and I'll keep watching the chat to see what you all have to say. So our second question, how do we engage or encourage students to explore non-traditional options? And I would add particularly now, in the context we'll be starting from more or less.
Yeah, I'm going to start us off on this one. So, post-pandemic, we're all going to be in a situation where the programs that are put in front of the students for them to select from is going to be more important than ever. Many of us are going to have to refine our portfolios again. I'm just going to use a real specific example. Like, I'm down staff, right? I'm obviously down staff. I don't have enough staff to advise for the 400 or a million programs that we used to have. We've got to go through some strategy again with portfolio. And that's going to mean that we have to be even more cautious. Now, the complexity of this is we still don't know what's going to be open. I don't know, like the rest of you, I canceled some more programs yesterday because another country's borders are yet to be open. And we're not out of the woods. I keep telling my staff, we've got 9 months to go. Let's get to Christmas. Let's get to Christmas and see where things look like for next year. So what we put in front of them, they consume, right? If we don't put it in front of them, they won't consume it. So that's part of it. It's just getting our ducks in a row. I also, some of you who know me really well, Allie's little picture is right below mine, so I'll use Allie as an example. But some of you have heard me say before, quit trying to convert the masses. Quit trying to get your kids who are supposed to be going to Spain to go to Latin America. We have proven at UT Austin, at least for our institution, you cannot convert them. You cannot. So give up, let them be, go find a different population of students who can benefit from going to Latin America. Now put it in front of the Spain kids. I'm not saying walk away from it, But if you spend all your energies trying to convert them, you'll just be frustrated at the end. And there are so many students on our campus who still need and are perfect for these experiences, that we can grow our engagement in that way. We do find too that for encouraging students to go to non-traditional locations, we have to give them more information. There are so many reviews out there on how to study in Barcelona, right? I'm just going to keep using that as an example, or how to study in London, that when you Google it, it comes up and up and up and up and up. But if you try to Google studying abroad in Jordan and find student reviews for kids who went to Jordan, it's like two, right? Maybe. So some of it too is that we just have to get more students in front of each other. And I know one way that we do that is when we hire our peers. We try our best when we hire our peer mentors every year to make sure they were all at non-traditional locations. Now, we're not always successful given who our peer candidate pool is, but that student to student voice, if you have a student that went to Jordan and they're in your peer team and they're doing the presentations and they're the one talking to the student orgs, then Jordan is going to keep coming up, right? Because it's their personal experience that they're sharing through those events, student to student, peer to peer. And so that's a really concrete way to encourage students. Another one that I know many of us have worked on or still striving to be dedicated to and near and dear to Margaret's heart is curriculum integration. If you haven't matched coursework in your non-traditional locations, this is a plug for chart right here, everybody go look at chart, then your kids can't find the classes. And if your kids can't find the classes, they're gonna go to Barcelona, right? So that's on us to make sure, again, that we have enough information out there that they can see the options without having to dig. And there's a little bit of history of if you were going to a non-traditional location, you had to dig twice as hard or 3 times or 4 times as hard as the students going to the mega cities, the Tokyos, the Londons, the Parises, right? So, that's a piece of it too. And the trick with post-pandemic is going to be, do we have the resources to dig deep? Do we all have the time in our days to get this information and sustain it, not even getting it, but sustaining what we had done before through the next 9 to 12 months. So it's going to be tricky, especially if you're like me and you're down staff. Nicole, other thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to highlight something from the chat too, that I think it was in response to our last question, but I think it applies here as well. And that's Morena's comment about non-traditional locations can often include heritage locations for minoritized American students, BIPOC. And it's invaluable for this population of students to experience this part of their identity and become better informed about life, politics, community, values, beliefs. I think that, this is also in kind of linking that to what you're talking about with the peer mentors as well, right? Students, a lot of minoritized students come in and talk about kind of fear of how they're going to be perceived abroad, and kind of being able to link them through other students and being able to provide opportunities that are able to address some of those fears, and not just to direct students into those places because they come from a minority background, but to give them a full slate of options where they have different kinds of opportunities available, some of which might address curricular needs in a particular way, or some of them might address identity concerns in a particular way. I think for me, engaging and encouraging students comes down to 2 things. One, faculty engagement. Our faculty play a huge role in A, encouraging students to study abroad, and B, influencing their choice of destination. And so it links to curriculum integration, right? But also that making sure that programs have a home and champions on your campus, that you're not just kind of developing programs in a vacuum that don't have a faculty member or a department that's really going to be encouraging students to study in those programs. And then on the individual level, kind of in terms of how we're advising students, and I like to take a approach of really asking students questions about their goals, and encouraging them to think about the opportunity of living abroad versus traveling abroad. Because I notice a lot of the students who come into our office, when you ask them kind of what they're interested in, a lot of them have just been very heavily influenced by this narrative of, I've got to go to Europe so I can travel everywhere. And that's what everybody's talking about. And if the majority of students are still going to Western Europe, that's what they hear the most. And so anytime I get a hint that a student might be interested in a non-traditional destination or something a little bit off the path, but they're being pulled somewhere else by the herd, I really try to dig that out of them. And I think that question of kind of, if you have one chance in your life to go and really be somewhere for 4 or 6 months, you know, and really get to know people and work on a language and be somewhere that you're not going to have access to as a tourist in the same way, where can you go and kind of have the most impactful experience for yourself? And oftentimes that kind of encourages students to pivot and think about some of the more off the beaten path destinations in a different way. And then through that too, really immediately connecting them with the student voices who can talk about that and affirm what they're hearing from me, because we know it really matters so much more coming from their peers. And really demystifying. I think there's a lot of fear around non-traditional destinations. You know, there's kind of concerns about health and safety that may or may not be grounded in reality. And also to highlight some of the benefits, right? There's often lower cost associated with traveling to non-traditional destinations. And so those are kind of the two prongs, working with the faculty and then kind of thinking about it all the time in the approach with the students. I don't let students get off easy when they come in immediately talking about London or Paris. We kind of dig in a little bit deeper.
And I was going to go back over to the comments too. Chelsea's comment about the parent and the UGG India, you know, that is all of our experiences, right? And my comment to that would be, when we're building programs, if we know we're going to get the UGG India, then we have to put out there the why first, right? You have to put the why out there first. Why? Because of career. Why? Because your college picked this program for you. Your college picked it. That means your college thinks it's the bomb, right? I didn't randomly pick it. I don't have that kind of power, right? Now, some of you might, but right? But where did this stem from? Or this faculty is amazing, and why? So, and I know that's hard to do in speed dating at study abroad fairs, but preparing for it when we know we're building a non-traditional location, preparing for the why more than we ever do when we're preparing for a European destination. Yeah.
Anyone on the call want to jump in at this point? The chat has been really fascinating. Some great comments over there. No questions at this point, which is completely fine. But I love the feedback that we're getting this way to enrich our conversation. So I just want to pause before we keep moving forward in case someone would like to verbalize what they're thinking right now or ask a question of the group. All right. Question 3.
One more quick anecdote to
of
kind
course.
Of go back to the India piece. So years ago, I was advising a student who really wanted to study abroad in Tanzania. And it was an amazing opportunity. And it was a program that was really perfect for the student's engineering major. And his mom was terrified. And his mom was saying, you know, well, there's child soldiers and everybody is starving in Africa. And that just blew my mind, right? And I had lived in Tanzania a while ago and had sent him pictures of me like holding baby turtles and, you know, described different experiences I had had I said, you know, share this picture with your mom. You know, I was in my early 20s, a young woman in her early 20s by herself in Tanzania holding a baby turtle, just to kind of give her a different image than whatever images she'd been seeing. And I think, you know, some of that is just so important, is giving alternative images and alternative stories that people can share instead of just saying, no, that's not true, or that's not really actually finding something to replace it with.
It's actually a really great segue into the next question, which I think of as kind of how we complicate the narrative in part. Did one of you want to kick us off from this? So our question, how can purposeful program design contribute to expanding student engagement in non-traditional locations?
So I know this is different for every Ed Abroad office and what your control level is over program design, whether you're able to pick where your reciprocal exchanges are, whether those get handed to you and you have to shepherd them, or whether or not you're controlling the faculty-led proposal cycle, or anybody can do anything and you have to pick it up and support it along the way. So I'm going to just put that out there first. But if you can think, oh, no, we went pink. Oh, we just went pink, Margaret. Sorry, I don't know why we're pink, but that's pretty.
How you know this is live?
This is live. We just got Zoom bombed. I don't know what that was, but I'll keep going. But thinking about if you're, my unit, as large as it is, and the number of students, we're very actually quite traditional. Nicole's shop is way more innovative than my shop because they're working with a smaller set of students, I think, probably. But when you're looking at it from this very traditional research lens where you have a number of exchanges, then the purposeful program design does also, in my mind, also mean that at some point you have to gain some authority. Otherwise, your faculty will just keep building things almost like the students in the narrative that they're used to. I was at I'll tell an anecdote as well. I was on a call with my study abroad committee in my College of Education on Monday. It's a group of 8 faculty and me, and they were having a discussion that came around to, which is more diverse, Switzerland or Copenhagen? It was fascinating, y'all. It was absolutely fascinating to hear these faculty discuss the difference between Switzerland or Copenhagen. But it came down to the people, the culture of the peoples in those countries and those cities, and even and the student experiences, and they were co-sharing these ideas together. But in the end, I say this with this context of authority because that committee has the authority to decide where their college's study abroad programs are. And so having that discussion about purposeful design in those kinds of committee meetings when you're doing the faculty-led program development, or if we had been debating on where to put the next exchange partnership. If you're on a campus like mine that doesn't naturally migrate to the Middle East or Africa, then making sure that those ideas are still being put forward, even if your faculty aren't championing them. Making sure that you do have an affiliate portfolio like the one that IFSA provides to probably, of course, everyone on this call, that is quite diverse, so that you can make sure that you have some balance to your opportunities. Make, things like big city, like I was saying a minute ago, big cities versus small cities. Some ways that we've been doing some things have to do with faculty seed grants. And these aren't big amounts of money, but I mean, really, y'all, not big amounts of money. $3,000 to get a faculty member on an airplane to, of course, some of this was pre-COVID or will be post-COVID, but to get a faculty member to go see something. Maybe you know of a partner, or you know of you want them to go visit an IFSA site that aligns with your academic mission. And you really need them to be on the ground to see it once we all get back, or a virtual site visit, something along those lines. But really for us, the purposeful design goes back first and foremost to the academics and to the career development mission of your university, right? And what are those things, and how do you align program design to be to it? But then Nicole and I were having a discussion about even if you're building a program in London and it's traditional location by I think we would all agree that it's a traditional location, how do you add those non-traditional elements into it so the students aren't seeing little L London, right? They're seeing a different London, a London that they may not see in movies, a London that has massive diversity, right? And that is on all of us to make sure that we're not just taking every student to see Big Ben. Why aren't we taking them to see the Multicultural Museum? Or why aren't we taking them to see we have a social work program that goes to see the first social work community in London, the birthplace of social work, right? Those kinds of things. And so that kind of thoughtful design, even if you are in a traditional city, can still be an element of your purposeful design. So I know Nicole had some other examples on those as well.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, the London example is a really great one. And I think sometimes we do hear from students, we at Pomona are hearing more and more from students who are being drawn to a place like London or to Paris because of the diversity, and because they feel, particularly if they're a student of color, they feel like they'll be safer, or they'll have more opportunities to find community, or kind of not experience as much racism. So I think that is something that I would love to see more and more programs develop really intentionally, kind of how the program itself is facilitating engagement with diverse communities and cultures and views within some of the more kind of big traditional destinations. I think for me, I think program design really comes down to ethical, collaborative, sustainable engagement with community partners. I think you've got to be in it for the long game. You've got to be thinking about kind of how can the program benefit the folks on site and kind of make them also want to keep contributing and being engaged in the program itself. And then that also the student experience itself, because as we know, returnee voices play a really big role. And so if one student comes back from a program, and maybe they're the one student who's been there in the past 3 years and they had a terrible experience, that's going to influence the potential for students to come for years. And we've had that happen in some really great locations where students, you know, for years, students are having an amazing experience, and you get one student whose mindset's just a little bit different and they come back and they didn't like it, and that really impacted enrollment in that program for years. So really thinking about how the programs are serving the students themselves and how they're creating transformative experiences where students, no matter kind of how, like at what level they're coming into the experience, that they're able to be engaged in really meaningful ways. And that's pretty much all I have to say about that. I think we've touched on some of the other topics.
I had one other thought before we go to the next slide, which has to do with coming out of COVID and our staffing levels. We try to keep our team members with as much of a balanced portfolio as possible, right? But to balance Spain against someone who's doing the advising for Latin America, recognizing as supervisors that the person who's doing Spain is going to have 10 programs for us with 300 kids. And they're going to meet with each of those students one time, and it's lickety split, right? The the program coordinator who has Latin America is going to have more programs, perhaps, spread all over Latin America. And they're going to have to meet with that student going to Latin America 5 times before you convince them to get on a plane, versus 1 time to convince them to get on a plane to Spain. That too becomes quite a bit about, it's not purposeful program design, but purposeful advising design. And making sure that you have allocated and are in some ways making sure that your staff feel validated, that everything's not equal, right? One group might take less advising time, and another group, especially to non-traditional locations, it's not going to be a one and done, because they need more convincing sometimes. They need more of the explanation of the why. So I was thinking about that as Nicole was talking, going through that last example. It made me think about that, because that scenario on our campus, that's what it took. It takes 5 times to get a student to go, 5 times the advising time to get a student to go there, and making sure you have a plan for that resource allocation. That is part of the purposeful design as well. Or you have to hold 5 times as many information sessions, right, for the kids that want to go to Uruguay, the program to Uruguay, than the program to Spain, for example. And that's a piece of the trick too. Yeah, at least for us it is.
I think we've rolled questions 3 and 4 into one.
Oh no, I didn't look ahead.
That's what I mean. It's a conversation. It doesn't matter which order we go in. And it's been picked up in the chat as well, which is really great. There's some good suggestions there around what this might look like. I like your point, Heather, too, about the advising process. You know, for us with this particular question, it influenced how we designed a life science program in London, to make sure that it wasn't just the traditional version of London, the traditional view of the sciences themselves. And when you start digging, you'd be amazed at the kinds of resources and opportunities that are there, but you do have to prioritize it. Because I have a question for both of you and anyone else on this call. So we've acknowledged throughout this conversation that resources are not where they were. That may not be true for all of us, but certainly from IFSA's perspective, as we talk to campuses, many people have had staff reassigned, or they've taken on additional roles to help the university out in different ways. So if it is true that it takes more effort and more intentionality from the campus side to help students reach these destinations for the why, the capital W-Y, how do you see that playing out going forward?
I think one thing that we've implemented at Pomona that has really enhanced our capacity, and it's a positive byproduct from COVID, is really taking advantage of virtual advising with our third-party providers. And you know, our peer mentors do a lot of work in terms of developing events and resources and kind of having their voices heard. But we're also really trying to provide opportunities for students to connect directly with the providers. And I think that is helpful because the providers just know so much more detail about the programs and can really highlight the opportunities, especially of some of the non-traditional locations. And so that has actually, I feel that that has kind of lowered a little bit of our advising load. And whether that's for non-traditional or any destination, you know, any kind of relief you can get in terms of sending a gentle, friendly handoff to someone who can help with that is really great. So that's one idea.
I think from our lens, it's going to be about strategy, right? You've got to figure out, we've got to figure out, we're in the middle of this right this minute, which is why I'm laughing, because it gives me a little bit of anxiety, obviously, but we've got to figure out what is really going to be viable for 2022. Which programs are going to be open, which centers are going to be open, which exchange partners are going to let me send masses and which ones aren't. And it may be that we have to shrink our portfolio for a little bit of time and then rebuild it because we can't do everything, right? Every single person on this call has been working 68 hours a week since January of 2020. And I keep reminding my boss all the time that we started in January with China before everybody else started in March. So we got 2 months on the whole world. So, you know, and we've just got to recalibrate, and that's going to have a lot to do with portfolio and where we put our resources. We have also, to Nicole's point about where are there people who can help you? Right? We have spent a lot of time during the pandemic, not like we had ever had a minute where we were sitting still, making sure that some key academic advisors could do frontline advising. That is a hard conversation in some colleges, but in colleges where they are really dedicated, or certain departments where they're really dedicated to the international mission, we actually spent some time doing train the trainer programs with our academic colleagues to replace our peers, because we don't have peers right now, and we're not going to have student workers next year. My budget for it isn't there. So not paid peers anyway. We'll have a volunteer corps, but this concept of academic advisors. I know a lot of us have very, very robust collaborations with our academic advisors, but some of us don't, or you have it in one place but not in another place, right? I'll give you an example though. A very concrete example of how your academic advising team, if you're not careful, can hurt you versus help you. And I'm not sure if any of them are on this call, but they're good friends. But we have a degree in our College of Liberal Arts that has mandatory study abroad as part of the degree. And the academic advisors in that college, in that department, got connected. They got themselves stuck in promoting 2 particular programs in Europe over and over and over and over and over again. And I was during the pandemic, I was like, why are we getting a flood for these 2 places? And I finally figured out it's because these 2 academic advisors, it's all they talk about. And they got 800 kids. So my problem is that I don't have enough programming, is I've got 2 academic advisors who are on a recording talking about 2 programs. So one of my initiatives is I've got to get those 2 academic advisors to talk about something else. Right? To expand their vocabulary, expand their understanding, even if it's by 2 programs. I don't have to have them know everything, but I've got to have them have counterbalance to these 2 programs in Europe that they are just, mind my French, but shoving down some kids' throats. I'm like, okay, y'all, right? Let's have a conversation about this. And they're not meaning to do it on purpose. It's just how it's played out. But it became very evident during the pandemic that that's what was happening. So that's one real critical way to change perspectives is your academic advising community. And I don't know if any of you are a part of NACADA, but I have said for years that NAFSA and NACADA needed to be better friends, and that 90% of study abroad people should be going to NACADA, and we need to infiltrate NACADA. But some of you may be doing that, but I don't know. I actually haven't ever paid attention to the national conference proposals, but I know there is a study abroad committee, but not as strong as it should be. That relationship is so critical. So trying to get, when we were in person, when Heather would come to campus or some other IFSA staff would come to campus, we had a rule on our campus that they had to meet with 1 or 2 academic advisors every time they were there, right? Even if they were just coming to our fair, we would try to make sure that they had a private meeting with academic advisors. Or if they were coming to help with a pre-departure, we would make sure they had a private meeting with some academic advisors. And I would wish we had done more of that during the pandemic, but it's been a little challenging to get ahead of your own mind right now. But I leave you with that thought. Yeah.
I also want to give a plug here for the virtual opportunities, because I think that these are can be a really great way to, whether it's COIL or whether it's, some of the opportunities that third-party providers are coming up with, or something that you develop on your own. For us, and the data is still out because our students are just kind of still in the first semester at Pomona doing this. But for us, we saw that giving students the chance to do one virtual internship course, and all the ones that we picked were very selective. They were already through programs, through providers that we already approved. So it was kind of an extension of the on-site program that had already been vetted and approved. It was a course that was basically being modified slightly for the virtual environment. It gives students access to that, right? It helps support the providers. It allows them to fit it into their coursework on campus. So, when I think back to myself in college, I don't think I would have been ready to go to a non-traditional destination because of just the ideas I had about, one, I probably wasn't interested. 2, I just had these ideas of what it was. And for some students, we also see, they might have health issues that would be challenging to get care abroad, or there might be other factors at play. Maybe they can't even do study abroad for a whole semester. So giving them access through one course, we hope will really help to kind of build and deepen students' overall academic plan and goals. And so I think in terms of long-term strategy, it's something I would actually like to see stick around, because I think it opens study abroad up to undocumented students who aren't able to actually travel, and to many other students who can't travel. And it incorporates it into what they're already doing on campus, especially for students who don't have as much flexibility. And for some, maybe it's the taste. Maybe the students that I've noticed being interested in some of these courses are some of our students who are planning to study at Oxford or Cambridge or places that were very traditional, and here they are applying for something in Cameroon. So, I think it's a really cool way to engage students who might not have thought about that. And then lastly, for us, aside from the work that went into setting it up, it's a pretty low effort piece because we have it as sort of an enrollment process. So we're not doing a ton of advising. We do an info session. It's just one course. They're not going anywhere. So the level of information and handholding needed for these students is much lower, but the potential for the high academic impact could be quite high. So I see it both as kind of an opportunity for getting students to have access to non-traditional locations without travel, but also for helping build capacity in support of the academic mission of study abroad.
Yeah, for us, we added on a layer to that as well, and we love our global virtual exchanges. We went to our undergraduate college, who sponsors all of what are our mandatory freshman seminars, and we try to make sure that one of those freshman seminars every year is a global virtual exchange, so that it gets kind of word on the street within that community as well. And so those strategic partnerships for the COIL courses or the virtual global, I don't know who Nicole's building hers with, but, it also helped us too, because we built it with our Faculty Innovation Center, which is the group of curriculum design experts on our campus. And because we got them involved in our COIL and our virtual activities, then they had context. And so even when they were meeting with faculty without us about regular course innovation design, they would start talking to faculty about, oh, what about this for you? Even without us there. So that was a really big advantage too for us as we were building our COIL projects, those kinds of collaborations. I know that if we hadn't built Global Virtual Exchange, we would have never talked to our Faculty Innovation Center. That's a whole different arm of our university. But through that lens, it created a flow of information that's been very successful.
I want to highlight Neva's comment in the chat about kind of getting students out and about around the community near your colleges, and also kind of extend that to thinking about domestic programs as non-traditional locations. And for me, that's somewhat resonant as well, because I served as a Peace Corps volunteer, and a constant thought that went through my head over those 2 years was, what am I doing here? Why did I come all the way here to do this work when there's so much in my own community? And a lot of that had to do with kind of constantly having to defend that America is not completely wealthy and talk about the issues that existed in the US. And so I think also just, especially in the COVID moment, right? And especially for those of us who are being very conservative about when we will send students abroad again and under what conditions, really thinking about helping them to become more aware of diversity and circumstances and opportunities and issues in their own country through domestic programs. We don't have to be sending students, maybe this isn't a popular thing to say in a study abroad session, but we don't have to be sending students all around the world to explore these issues of race and culture and class and diversity. There's so much in the US too. And I think that speaking as someone who does not do domestic programs out of our office, I do think that this is something that we need to examine as a potential area of growth for non-traditions in the field of international education.
Yeah, I think it's been fascinating. I'm on different subgroup calls every couple of weeks with either our sports group, our Big 12, or different directors subsets. And I was on a call a couple of weeks ago where I think probably 30 to 40% of the people on the call had said that during COVID, they had gotten assigned study away, domestic study abroad, as part of a change in mission during COVID. I can't wait to see some statistics on this. I don't know if it was just the group on the call I happened to be on, but I thought that was fascinating. Another question that Open Doors forgot to ask this year. So, but yeah, I totally agree with Nicole. One thing we didn't touch on at all had to do with finances and non-traditional locations. So I'll say just a few words about that because I just looked down at my notes. One, of course, targeted scholarships. You think, oh, have thy scholarship, they shall come. No, they don't. I've had plenty of money for Latin America for years, and I have to beat the bushes to get kids to apply for it. So it's not that easy. Does it help? Yes, mainly because it spurs conversation, right? Or it creates that accidental awareness, as I've been calling things lately, where they see it on a website. And they're like, oh, there's a scholarship for Latin America. And they maybe go look at something else. At least it's kind of like subliminal marketing. So if you have any control over your scholarships, if you haven't repartitioned some of those monies to go towards non-traditional programming like a COIL or non-traditional locations, I would encourage you, if you have the chance to do so, as you're refining your practices for next year, to think about that as a mode. And then to make sure that you do have programs in Latin America that are cost effective. Just because you're going, not just Latin America, sorry, that's just what's on my mind, but just because you're going to a non-traditional location, some people can correlate non-traditional equals cheaper. Not always, not always. So that's another thing, is making sure that your non-traditional locations are at a price point that is accessible, right? And if all your non-traditional location programs are super expensive, then you're going to have, of course, you're going to have a problem, right? So that's another thing too, is making sure that you've looked at it from that financial lens. On my campus, the way our money works, I have to be very careful about having enough in residence programs versus transfer credit programs, because my money works based on my credit model. And so that's part of that structural design we were talking about a minute ago. I have to make sure I have enough non-traditional locations on both credit models because of the way the students' money works. With our institutional resources. So that's an element to all of this also, is the finances. Mm-hmm.
I have to say, for a conversation about non-traditional locations, it's been pretty far-reaching, which is perfect. And we have a question for both of you, but for the group. What, if any, feedback have you heard from students about the term non-traditional locations? Has their campus ever considered refraining from using this term or reference altogether? And what would the alternative be for us?
I was going to share a story with y'all a minute ago. I decided not to, but I'll go ahead and share it. This is going to sound like we were tricking kids, but we really weren't. We try our best not to use the term non-traditional locations. About 3 or 4 years ago, we started a campaign that was called the Mega Cities Campaign. And guess which city in the world we predominantly talked about when we were doing our Mega Cities campaign?
Mexico City.
That was second. What do you think was first? But to be careful with Mexico City and Texas, because kids are like, it's too close all day long. Buenos Aires. We were like, okay, because you could show pictures of Buenos Aires. It looks very European, right? So it wasn't as shocking. Again, to Nicole's point earlier about changing the imagery. A lot of people think Latin America is all pyramids and rainforests, making sure they understood that, you know, there are these big mega cities. And so we did an entire series for 2 years on mega cities. And it was, yes, we talked about London and Paris and Tokyo, but we also talked about Mexico City and Buenos Aires. And we talked about those first before. And then if we didn't even have time to talk about Paris and London, we just wouldn't even talk about it. So yeah, I think students don't want to, in my mind, there is a subset of students who do want to be openly non-traditional. Like they are seeking to be unique. But there are a lot of students who are willing to go wherever, but that term non, it's the non, which Nicole and I had a whole discussion about a week ago about, is it off the beaten path, or is that still too scary to some students? Or is it just, like I was saying, your college picked this one, right? And there is something about the terminology, to Alexis's point, my apologies. There absolutely is. You won't find the word non-traditional on our website anywhere. You'll find things like premier partner. You'll find things like prestigious scholarship, things like that. Nicole, how about y'all? Do y'all use it?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether we use it. I think that's actually a good question. I'd have to go back. And I guess I would put the question back as, why are we labeling it at all? I mean, I find all kinds of these labels. Like I specifically don't use Western, Eastern, global North, global South, developed, undeveloped. I hate that. I won't use it. And so I think it indicates sort of a dichotomy to students, or we're labeling something for students that's just an arbitrary label. And that's kind of where, you know, I was saying before, it's a moving target. It's just based on where students have been studying abroad for, 20, 30, 50 years. So I think, Heather's approach of really just kind of trying to talk about the locations as they are, and trying to represent each location or each program as a unique individual opportunity is the approach that we like to take.
And when we started some of our initiatives, we had to have a retraining of staff. I thought of it along the lines recently around advanced DEI training, like to make sure that your team know the vocabulary, that your mission and vision correlate to that, right? And making sure that maybe you don't have it on your website, but if someone sits down especially if you have an entry-level program coordinators who it's their first time being a study abroad advisor and really need the guidance, you have to be real specific. You have to make sure they're not saying in advising appointments, hey, why don't, things like, oh, nobody goes to Latin America. Are you sure you want to go there? Or, yes, it's a non-traditional, or I don't know, something in advising. There is something about making sure your team is using the lexicon that is putting your mission forward. And sometimes we forget to check ourselves and our teams. And I know that I myself have caught myself before, especially in talking about Africa, because it's so underrepresented for us. And even that term, underrepresented.
Exactly.
Have to be careful with. Yeah.
That is the perfect ending point for today's leadership series. It leaves us all with something further to think about and act on. And we are at time. So I want to thank you both for taking the time to really think this through and share your different perspectives. And thanks to all of you for joining us. I have learned something, as I always do, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Enjoy your afternoon.